Our speaker this evening is Alan Friedman from the Buffalo area. He is a very accomplished solar astrophotographer, and his talk will be on solar to the max, since we have a maximum sunspot event coming up. Alan is an artist and an astrophotographer who records our neighborhood star from his backyard in Buffalo. He's a 4-time recipient of the Astronomy Photographer of the Year Awards hosted by the Royal Observatory, and his solar portraits have been featured in the exhibition of the same name at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, England. His photography has been the subject of books, lectures, a TEDx talk, and featured on NASA's popular website, Astronomy Phonograph of the Day. Alan's work has been exhibited nationally, including a collaborative show, Fire and Ice, and a solo show, Into the Night, which was mounted at the Palm Court Gallery, Orange County, California, in conjunction with the Solar Decathlon. By day, Alan is president and CEO of Great Arrow Graphics, a greeting card publisher. He is a research associate at the Buffalo Museum of Science and a director of the Buffalo Astronomical Association. We are very honored to have you here, sir, this evening, and we're all looking forward to your talk. We have very good astrophotographers in our group, just to mention that. Thank you, Alan.
Cool. Well, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. It was great to meet Steve and get to spend some time with him at NEAF. And he had asked if I would do this, and I'm very happy to talk with you. So I'm going to give a presentation from my laptop. I'll do that through screen sharing. I've been giving talks for some time on solar astrophotography. It's a passion of mine, and it's becoming a passion of a lot of people now that the sun is back to approaching solar maximum, and we're getting ready for an eclipse, which is going to pass directly over Buffalo, New York. You guys are going to have somewhere between 90 and 95% down there, but I hope you're all planning to get in the car and go somewhere a little bit closer. So I think what I'll do is share my screen and see how that works. So this is a talk I call Solar to the Max. I had a slightly different topic name to it when we were emerging from solar minimum. But we are now deep in the midst of heavy solar activity. So Solar to the Max is a good name. So back to the beginning. And this is the idealized view of my backyard, and this is the real view. And now you can see the eclipse with the transformer in my power line in my backyard. It's not an ideal place to do any kind of astrophotography, but it's challenging for solar too, because there's a million power lines and cable lines, and some people even have landline telephones that are blocking the view. And Buffalo is a challenging place for a bunch of reasons. We've got a lot of clouds, always looking for things to peek through the cloud holes. And then we have this, which we are known for. This is my observatory at the beginning of last winter, and this was my porch on Christmas Day last year. So there are a lot of days that I can't see the sun, and on some of the good days to do astronomy, there were always dance recitals and other things that made it a difficult passion. But it is very close to my backyard, which that is the good thing about my observatory and allows me to use it a lot. This is not my observatory. This is the Nordic telescope, and I believe it's in Sweden, but I've forgotten exactly where it is. But I have it in this show because of this photo, which in 1990 was the highest resolution image of Saturn that had been taken from Earth. And short time later, it was possible for amateurs to take more detailed images of Saturn than could be done a decade before by telescopes 10 times their aperture. This is what happens to be from my backyard in a 10-inch telescope, through a 10-inch telescope, and many planetary astronomers have far surpassed what I can do from my backyard with my 10-inch Mac. I started off my astrophotography. I never really did much deep sky because of my location, but I used to do quite a bit of planetary photography. This was a little study of Saturn over the course of 6 years, from 2004 to 2009, watching the rings close. The one at the lower right is the earliest image in this group. And I did my fair share of lunar imaging. I enjoyed using my 10-inch scope and trying to get as much out of it as I could. I still try and do that from time to time, but the nights of good seeing up our way are just few and far between. So my lunar images were mostly taken on a handful of nights when we had uncharacteristically good seeing. This is not my image. This is a Casini image, and it makes one wonder why we knock our heads against the wall doing this stuff. Those of you who do astrophotography, because no matter how good our seeing is or how good our timing is, the sun has multiple orbiting observatories taking pictures 7 days a week, 365 days a year, and it's fascinating to keep on top of them and frustrating to try and keep up with them. So one of the things that we can do is tell stories. And that is a lot of what I'm interested in doing in my astrophotography, telling stories, of course, to my astro friends, but also to people who don't have a background in science or astronomy, to try and capture their fancy and their interest in knowing more. And we all do this with the work that we do in public astronomy. I put this picture in here because I love what it does with a lot of difficulty. It celebrates what our eyes do without any trouble whatsoever, which is seeing both the sunlit portion of a crescent moon and the earthlit portion of the crescent moon at the same time, without different exposures. You just look at it and that's what you see. And when you try and do this with a camera, it's obviously real challenging. If you want the earth shine, you totally overexpose the sunshine area. So this image was a compilation of 2 exposures put together with the chestnut trees in front of my house added for good measure. It's an image I've done a couple of times, this one fairly recently. The first version I did of this was my first published image in Sky and Telescope in the early 1990s. This is my backyard and a collection of some of my telescopes. They're all together because they are all telescopes made by Astrophysics in Rockford, Illinois. It's a wonderful company and they make beautiful instruments. And I've been very fortunate to own their smallest scope that they ever made, which is the little stowaway in the front, and the 10-inch Mac. Actually, Roland has made 12-inch Macs as well. But at the time I got this, it was the biggest scope they had ever made. And rounding it out is the 6-inch refractor and a 4-inch traveler refractor. And this is the littlest one. It's an F5 stowaway. It's one of the smallest 90-millimeter telescopes you can buy. It's 14 inches long, and it is the basis of my solar gear that I use most frequently. I call it Little Big Man because it is probably the most compact 90-millimeter solar telescope that you can have. Above it is the Coronado Solar Max 90, which I purchased in 2000 or 2001. I'm not positive. It's a very nice Etalon. And above it is my little grasshopper camera, which is a 6 megapixel camera and can capture the full disk of the sun at a focal length of up to a meter. And here's little big man riding on the back of the 10-inch Mac, both of them set up for solar observing. It's carried by an Astrophysics 1200 mount, one of their older mounts, but it does a nice job of carrying this amount of weight. Here's another view of little big man riding on the tube rings for the 6-inch scope on the 1200 in my backyard. And this is me taking pictures of sunspots through a very important accessory, a solar cloth, which was covered in silver lame by my wife, who is a costume designer, now retired from the State University of New York at Buffalo. But we wear these because everybody looks better with silver lame. So one of the beauties of this little equipment is that you can travel around with it. This was an evening I was out on the shores of Lake Erie, and there was a solar eclipse going on, not a full eclipse, but a partial eclipse. And we'll see a picture from it later. But it's a really kind of wonderfully compact setup. You see the camera in the back, and that's plugged into my laptop, which is sitting on top of a lawn chair, which is sitting on top of a garbage pail. And that's the only power I've got going on there. Actually, I think the mount is probably plugged into a battery. But unlike deep sky photography, there's not a whole ton of cables. It's pretty easy to pack this stuff up and take it with you. And actually, a couple of weeks ago, I finally got a strain wave mount, which I've been looking to add this year. And it will make this setup even more compact when we get to the eclipse. Here's all my solar gear sitting in its old Halliburton case. You got the telescope, a diagonal, and an eyepiece for taking a quick look, a couple of Barlows, a couple of extension tubes. In the left corner is the solar Etalon, the hydrogen alpha Etalon, with the adapter ring that attaches it to the scope, and the blocking filter is underneath the cables. And I've got 3 cameras in here, and this will fit in a overhead bin on the airline. And it allows me to go places. This was a wonderful trip I took to Mount Wilson for the 2012 transit of Venus. I had watched the 2004 transit of Venus 8 years earlier from the rooftop of the Buffalo Museum of Science. But this was just a glorious event. Seeing was not so great that day, but it still was wonderful to be up on the mountain for the first transit of Venus that was visible since Mount Wilson was created in the early 20th century. And this was a picture from traveling down to the Winter Star Party. I got away and right after a talk that I gave and caught the space station in front of the sun. This was the first time that I had done that. I've done it quite a few times since. This was during very depths of solar minimum a few years ago. And this one was last year on the first day of summer when the sun much more active. And this is a fun challenge. I don't know if any of you folks have done this, but it's great. We have a member of our club who's real into predicting these events, and I just tag along when he tells us there's going to be one visible near our home. And I've done a couple of them where I've made mistakes and not used a fast enough shutter. This one got a pretty sharp picture of the space station. And it's fun to compare these two to show the difference of the sun between 2022 and 2020, the one on the left. And sometimes you just got to go to the top of a tall building. This is from my office where my greeting card company is based. That wonderful morning eclipse sun that we had a couple of years ago. So being able to move is pretty important. This was the trip down to Kentucky, southwestern Kentucky, where I viewed my first solar eclipse. I only took a handful of photographs, but what a tremendous experience that was. It makes me very excited for our eclipse next year. So the best way to get started with this stuff is exploring what you can do with a white light filter, which is just a filter which sends most of the energy of the sun away and allows a small amount of it to get through safely, in which you can see the sun in white light. These are 4 different versions: a glass Thousand Oaks filter, which I got when I first got my first refractor years ago, a couple of ready-made filters using Botter solar screen film, and the last one, the back, is one I made myself. This stuff is great. If you're interested and don't have it, it would be good to go pick some up, because I think it's going to be difficult to get as we get closer to the date of the eclipse. But it's wonderful stuff. There's all kinds of online resources about how to make a filter yourself for a scope that you might have. And the beautiful thing is you can use it with any size scope. So the filter on the right it will fit and give me a full aperture view in my 10-inch Mac CAS. So this is a picture that I don't do very often. Usually I use streaming cameras and the Lucky imaging techniques, but this is taken just with a camera. It actually was taken with a very good camera, a Leica monochrome camera, which has a 60 megapixel sensor, but it's a single exposure through the back of a telescope, rather than stacking a whole bunch of things. And it does a nice job and tells just a beautiful story of the sun when there are sunspots to see. You see the, you get hints to the granulation, and you can see the plage areas around the active regions. You can make very, very attractive and interesting pictures of the sun quite simply, and to show things that nobody ever really sees because they don't get out and stare at the sun. This was a recent attempt to try and shoot a larger sunspot with my 10-inch Mac. I've done quite a bit of this. It's very difficult from my backyard because of the seeing. So here you have a little bit of an eyepiece view of the sun at a focal length of, I think this is 7 meters, which is twice the focal length of my 10-inch Mac, which has a native focal length of 3,650 millimeters. So this is using a 2 times, probably a PowerMate as a tele-extender. And you can see glimpses of the granulation. I hope you can in the monitor that you're looking at there. It looks pretty good on my screen. But it's very challenging to try and work with data at this focal length. I often can't do it. And here is that data processed into a solar image where the granulation has been shown to better advantage using various kind of stacking techniques to take the best frames of the video and average them together, so there's enough headroom to sharpen it up and show the fine details. This was an image that was taken quite some time ago. It was the first image that won a prize at the Astronomy Photographer of the Year award. And this was that big, massive sunspot. Some of you might remember it from October. It was visible for a week in October of 2014. The data for this came from a good friend who lives in Arizona, Randy Shivak. And he sent me the data and I processed it. It's always good to have friends in Arizona and other good places. And just a couple of other images of the sun at high power. This is the same sunspot, but taken at half of the focal length, which is often easier to work with. And just a couple of full disk images, which are quite easy to do through any size telescope. And recording the sunspots is wonderful activity. This is that big sunspot shown at its size against the solar disk. I believe it was the largest sunspot grouping since the 1940s when it arrived in 2014 during the last solar maximum. And here's the same sunspot the day that I was shooting it on top of that garbage pail. The sun was being eclipsed as it set into Lake Erie. So sun was very low at this point in time, but it was just steady enough to get a pretty nice full disk image in hydrogen alpha. But shows you the difference between the view in white light and the view in the rarefied narrow band of hydrogen alpha, which is 656.5. I'm forgetting the last digit, nanometers down in the deep red end of the deep red end of the spectrum, where the activity of hydrogen gas in the chromosphere can be observed. And it shows all sorts of wonderful stuff. Here's a little view through the little big man with its with my 90 millimeter Etalon on the front of it. And you can see the wealth of whirls and swirls in the chromosphere that can be seen when you peer into it. It's the first time you see that, it makes it very hard to go back to white light viewing again. It's a very dramatic thing, and we really have to kiss the companies that have made these instruments available to amateurs. Daystar was the first to do it. Del Woods, who passed away at too young an age from cancer, who started that company, Jen, who continues it today, and Coronado, that pioneered the idea of putting the Etalon on the front of the telescope instead of back in the back, which means the Etalon has to have a lot of big pieces of glass, but it does some very wonderful things to do that, allowing you to take a picture of the full disk of the sun. So this was made back in 2009 when the sun was at the minimum before the last solar minimum, which was a few years ago. So this was 11 years before that. And I was getting really tired of looking at the sun like this, with basically nothing happening. There is a tiny sunspot in this image, but it's almost impossible to find. And just working on this image, I did something, I'm not exactly sure why, but I hit the invert button in Photoshop, and the image turned out like this. And it just struck me as being such a different look of the solar data. And of course, astronomical images are being inverted, scientific images are being inverted all the time to show things differently, let you appreciate contrast differently. If you ever take a look at a CAT scan, you'll see that the imaging technician is always inverting data to make it best seen to look for things that the CAT scan might show up. So I began a period of exploration into doing inverted solar images. This one is one that I took in 2010. I titled it, "It's Not the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown." And I sent it to APOD, who had used a few of my images, but they did not use this. They used an image of the Witch Nebula. It was taken right before Halloween in 2010. But it got picked up courtesy of Phil Plate and Jason Major and a couple of other people who shared it. And it was my brief moment in the sun, so to speak. It was all over the place. It was being tweeted by, well, I don't know if it was tweeting then. It was being shared by Harley Davidson clubs and paranormal clubs, all kinds of places. I had like a tremendous amount of activity on my website for a brief period of time. This is my most recent full disk image. It was taken a few weeks ago, utilizing a guest telescope in my backyard, a Lunt 130, with my 90 millimeter Etalon put on the front to make the bandpass even narrower than it is normally, which increases the contrast of the details. But I spent quite a bit of time exploring full disk portraits of the sun. This is what we might call a more traditionally processed image, where nothing is inverted. It's black and white data that's been colorized. And I'll just take you through a little run of the last 12 years of my solar imaging with a number of full disk images. And it's interesting to compare the two of these. This is the same image inverted. And some of these really show how the depth is so dramatically portrayed when the chromospheric details are inverted. And the filaments inverted tend to really show themselves atop the surface of the sun in a way that they just don't look the same in a traditional portrayal. This was kind of controversial when I first started doing it. As a matter of fact, I submitted a bunch of these to the Astronomy Photographer of the Year, and they were all not included up until the point where I won the award. And that year, every solar image in the exhibition used inverted processing technique. It was kind of full circle, which is a little weird in some ways. I kind of wasn't sure which images were mine and which images were everybody else's. I love the depth of the active regions up at the top of the sun in this image. They just really look like gashes in the solar surface. That happens when you get toward the limb. So we've gone through the period of high solar activity, and then the solar activity waned and was very, very slow for a bunch of years. Although we still had some nice prominences, sunspots were few and far between, and there were actually periods of almost a year where there was no sunspot activity. And again, it became a little hard. I've also explored shooting the sun up in the ultraviolet radiation wavelengths, this with a dedicated calcium K-line telescope up at 393 nanometers. Supposed to be still within the visible spectrum, but I can't see anything through the telescope that I use to take these. But it does a very nice job of taking pictures. And the sun started a couple of years ago, started showing some additional activity, and we're getting back to some exciting stuff happening now. So it's really something to look forward to, and it's really a golden time to get out your solar telescope and start exploring, because when we head back toward minimum, it's hard to sustain the energy. So another good place to get started is enjoying the prominences at the limb of the sun, which you'll need a hydrogen alpha filter to be able to do it, but you don't need a very narrow band one. Actually, a wider bandwidth, something 0.7 to 1 angstrom is very good for showing the prominences with good contrast. And I shoot a lot of these. These are some old ones, which I love because this type of solar phenomenon really looks like stuff. I always enjoy, trying to name images. It's fun to name them, and you can guess what this one is named. This one, when I have a live audience, I always love asking the group, what do you think this looks like? And people who've seen me talk a couple of times always yell out the answer, but this looks like Bigfoot. But they are beautiful solar prominences, and processing them can really be a joy. You can get some very nice detail with a small aperture telescope, and when there is a big one, it's just really fun to photograph it. One of the things with the sun, it's fascinating. The things can get big, which means that they can be photographed better in poor conditions. If you try and take a picture of Jupiter, it's never going to be any bigger than it is, and if you don't have good seeing, you're basically just out of luck for a sharp picture. But every once in a while, you get a solar prominence that's massive. And if it's massive like that, the whole scale of it makes seeing less important, which is a beautiful phenomenon. I can't think of much else that works that way. The other thing that we can do, of course, is step away further from our photograph when the seeing isn't optimum, which means taking a picture of the full disk rather than trying to zoom in at a longer effective focal length. So then there's the ability to add the surface detail into the image too, which tells a different story. And there are different ways to process this too. This big prominence was on the sun for quite a few days in a row, and it allowed me to photograph it and experiment with different techniques. And this is just different versions of positive and negative from the prom to the surface chromosphere. If the sun has something interesting going on at the limb, I almost always start with that. When the seeing is better, usually I'm pretty much done imaging by 10 a.m. There's a little window where before the sun gets up higher and heats all the rooftops and the neighbors surrounding me, it allows me to do good work early in the day. This was the remnants of a flare. I can't remember if it was an M class or X class flare at the moment. This is another one which was an X class flare taken about, I think it was about 5 minutes after the flare was recorded. And this was a very recent image, which shows the difference in the contrast in the chromospheric detail using my telescope, which has been loaned to me, the 130 with the 90 millimeter on the front. So it's still only 90 millimeters of aperture because I'm putting the 90 millimeter on the filter on the front, Etalon on the front, but it adds a lot of contrast and allows me to show the chromosphere with more contrast. This was the image that was the solar astronomy photography of the year in Greenwich a few years back before the pandemic. I knew it was going to win an award ahead of time, but I didn't know which one. So I schlepped my whole family with me to Greenwich, and we had a marvelous vacation. And I was so thrilled to be able to get an award. I just wanted to show you the process of doing this image. So I'm using a stacking program on my Mac. It's not one that you can really get anymore. The program is no longer available, but a lot of people use Registax and AstroStackert for the same thing. And what I'm doing is I'm creating multiple regions that you see on the left and processing each of those regions separately, aligning all the good frames. I should say the first thing that happens is the good frames are analyzed by the software program. And then I kind of leaf through them just to make sure that I agree with the job that the program did. And I can see them visually. After I've got my set of 300 or so frames, I will select multiple areas for stacking. And that means that each of these regions is aligned separately, and then they are mosaicked into the final image, which allows me to get maximum sharpness out of the chromospheric details in here. And this is the result on the right side. So one of the first things that I usually do, solar images are like news stories. You know, they become pretty boring after a little time has gone by. So if you want to share them like on Space Weather or something, or even with your club members on websites, it's good to get them out quickly while it's still almost happening. So one of the things that makes the detail much easier to see is to put an occulting disk in front of the white disk of the sun. Because it's like having a security light in your face. You can see the detail much better in the image on the right. You'll also notice that I've put up a sun-sized blue disk. I'm sorry, an Earth-sized blue disk on the image to give a sense of scale. And it's very easy to do that. There are a bunch of ways to do it. This is how I do it. This is in Photoshop, where I take the image and I expand my working field so I can scribe a big circle around it, a circle to show the full disk of the sun. And since we know that there are 109 Earth diameters in the diameter of the sun, running across the diameter of the sun, if I divide the pixel dimensions of this circle by 109, I will come up with a circle the size of the sun. And I can either size an Apollo image to put it in the image, or even just make a circle in there to give some sense of scale. And then finally, the Chromospheric Detail, which was a second exposure, was added to this, and then the whole thing was colorized, not very with weak saturation, but color images always sell better than black and white. Even though I have my heart in black and white photography, color images are a lot easier to sell to APOD or Space Weather or any other publishing site or magazine. This was a big Prominence from last year, and its Chromospheric Detail added. So just a few other projects that I've worked on. This was an image that was captured in high resolution by the Big Bear Solar Observatory back a number of years ago. I can see the date on it a couple of slides down. But this was put out to the amateur community on Facebook called Solar Activity by the, I can't remember his title, but he basically ran the telescope at Big Bear Solar Observatory. He retired a year or so later, but he needed a lot of permissions to be able to put this out in the amateur community, and he wanted to see what we would do to process it. So I played around with it and used the inversion technique and slight colorization just to add a sense of depth. I think it's interesting to look at the difference between the two of them. It's pretty much only inverted and a slight increase in contrast. But it's amazing what the difference in the perception of the chromospheric surface at high resolution by inverting it. This image, so this was 2015. Wow, that's 8 years ago already. But this was a selection from the APOD, and fascinatingly, the last image that Big Bear Solar Observatory had was this one in 1997. So we've come a long way, baby, in what we can do. And I'm an artist by trade, so I really enjoy the printmaking aspect of making physical prints of my work. This was a show I had with my friend Douglas Revere, who takes magnified images of snowflakes. I'm actually sitting behind one over here. I think I blurred my background on Zoom, but his work is really beautiful. And so I enjoy printing these out and just trying to play with the printerly qualities of the image, not just the screen display. This is one, I'll share a little bit of this with you. I think I'm sharing my sound. There was a musician in Northern Ireland who asked if he could map this. He makes musical compositions by mapping astronomical images. Let's see if that goes on for about 20 minutes, so I'll stop there. But this is work by a band in Astoria, which is near where I grew up in Queens, called Dystoria, and they came across some of my work and wanted to use it on their CD cover. I love when these types of synergies happen, and I always let them use it in exchange for tickets, 2 tickets to their first appearance on Saturday Night Live, which I'm still waiting for. And this was another nice project by a couple of artists who were working with the North Face Company of Japan called Nanamica. They did a series of books, color-based, on natural science. This was the last one from the series Roots of Life, about the sun. And they came to Buffalo and we created some images together. Each one was based on a color. Blue was Antarctica. Can't remember, the desert one was red, I think, and yellow was the sun. And it finished with a show in Tokyo at Nanamica's main store, which unfortunately I was invited to too late and couldn't go. But I did get a piece of sportswear from the project, a yellow jacket, which was, part of the project, of course, was sportswear that only fits people in Japan. So I have a large in this, and my kids, it's even too small for my kids. This is at NEAF, the Solar Star Party, which I used to go to regularly. This is the wonderful astrophotographer Thierry Legault looking through my little big man. And this is just at a public event out at our observatory in Western New York, which is my main passion, which I've been waylaid from since the pandemic, and I'm anxious to get back to it. I'm sure you guys are too, because you never know who's going to be in that papoose on the back of the person in front of your telescope. Sharing the view of the heavens with the kids is got to be the best thing in the world. So I really look forward to getting my machines out there and sharing the live view through space. When you have nothing to do someday, visit my website. It's called Averted Imagination. It'll take you to this, the old version. You can go into it. It'll actually take you there, and you can see some of the lunar and planetary stuff, or move on to my solar website. So that's kind of the end of this part of the presentation. And I will open it up. I do have some, I think we've gone about an hour already, concluding my my time, so it's probably long enough. I do have a couple of Photoshop files. If anyone is interested in seeing them and you want another couple of minutes, I can show some to you. But I'll leave it up to you. Maybe it's late and the pizza is calling.
No, I think we're up for those images.
Yeah? Okay. Okay. So let's see if I can do this without having to redo the sharing. Photoshop, I think, has it.
Okay. You see your whole
At
desktop
the
now?
main.
Let's take a look here.
You were getting your full workspace, but there's
That worked.
Photoshop.
That worked.
Did that work?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, great. So this is a recent image, and I just wanted to show you how some of the work that I do in layers is created. And I'm going to step backwards through this, and then we will apply it again. So this is the background image of the prominences. This is basically how this image was captured with the prominences and the white solar disk. The positive of the chromospheric detail could be added in there, but you see how the limb darkening, it just makes for a weird parent merger, I think, when they're put together. And it's what got me started with the idea of using the inverted data. Just to show you the difference of how that works. As the limb brightens toward the edge, I see the edge of the sun is showing there. It just gives a kind of more intuitive movement from the sun to the prominences. And of course, the dynamic range of the sun is so tremendous that it's very hard to show the same things at the same time. All of the things at the same time, at least in photography. Visually, it's easier, but it's kind of what led me to this work. And from there, I often like to go in and lighten the sky background. And I'm going to show you the secret technique that I use to do this, which I get asked a lot, and I hate to give it away, but I'm going to give it away to you guys because you were nice enough to invite me. So this layer 3 here is just a gradient, which was created using the gradient tool in Photoshop. And instead of being a normal layer, it is set up to be a screen. And remember that word screen, because the screen, if I make this a normal, it does different things. None of them really do the right thing. Lighten doesn't quite do it, but screen is just something that allows the detail from underneath it to come through. And originally it's a monochrome thing. I have added some color to it, just using the hue and saturation command in Photoshop to give it some color. But it adds a little daytime back in the picture, which, of course, when we photograph the sun, what are we using? 1/1000th of 1% of the sun's energy. So the sky is black, no question about it. But it's also, the sun is up in the daytime. And people, sometimes look at solar images and wonder how you could take a picture of the sun at night. And you're not taking a picture of the sun at night. So I take this liberty and lighten the background often. And then I use a colorized version of the chromospheric detail. And then I played around with the color just by adding, 30% of a solid color yellow because I thought this was pleasing. And the one thing I'm not including here, which was part of this, I think, yeah, there was a slight brightening of the prominences that was done in this image before it was done. And this was the finished version of it. So I think we have another one here that I'm going to show you. Yeah, let's look at the full disk images. It's fun to see. So here is a full disk. And again, it has many of the same techniques in it. So we're going to back off each one of these. Here's the original tonality as it was captured through my Etalon. In black and white, of course, and it's been processed. I don't think there's much change between these. Oh, it looks like just the values were changed. But here's the prominences. And this is some color added to the prominences. But we won't show that yet. Let's add the chromospheric detail. Oh, there's this one. And here is the screen gradation, creating a much lighter background. And this color looks a little weird, but I had also created a color version of the prom images. And I rather love the tonality in this image and the kind of strange mauvey sort of colors that the sky has in this. Here's a colorized version of the chromosphere, and then just a circle to add additional color into this. And it just goes you through some of the painting that I use when I make these images. And it is very clear that it is painting, but there's nothing that's really painted. We're painting with the data that's captured scientifically. And where you straddle on that fence between art and science is it's a fun fence. My work originally was too arty for the scientists and too sciencey for the artists. So I'm right sitting on the middle of that fence. I'm pretty comfortable with that spot. And thanks for listening. And now, if you have any questions, I'll stop sharing my screen and we can talk.
Outstanding. Marvelous. Okay, we've got at least one in the room here.
So I've always been interested in sunspot numbers and cycles and climate change. The current cycle, you've been observing it frequently, I assume. Does it look like it's going to be small, average, large?
I just saw a thing on space weather the other day that that this has been one of the fastest developing active max solar maxes in recent times. I think that article might still be up there. Initial forecasts were that it was expected that this might not be a highly active maximum, but we're at a level of activity that is higher than what might be expected in our pathway to solar max, which was originally forecast for 2025 to 26. Now it's maybe 2024. But we've had a ton of sunspots and good activity. We're starting to get some X flares. So I don't know. The sun has been watched for a long time. The Maunder minimum goes back a long ways. So back to the time of Galileo, I believe. So there are a lot of theories, and I don't know. I don't really follow them that carefully. I'm just happy when the sunspots return, and want it to last as long as possible.
Okay, thank you. That's interesting.
Are there any questions out in Zoom land?
I'm sure you all guys are all aware of spaceweather.com. It's a really great website run by Dr. Tony Phillips. Worth paying attention to. It'll show you the sun in white light every morning. So if you want to see if there are new sunspots coming around, lots of great pictures from amateurs around the world. Definitely, along with APOD, they're two of my favorite astronomy sites.
Are you planning on trying to image the annular eclipse that's coming up in October and then the next fuller one in April? And are you going to try and do that from the risky location of Buffalo?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a tough question. The annular eclipse, it looks pretty it's pretty mild from our area. What have we got? 20% or something like that. It's not going to be too exciting a photographic opportunity. But I'm sure I'll take a peek at it. It's going to be very hard to leave town for the solar eclipse, partly because I haven't prepared to do that, and I'm not quite sure where I would go other than I don't know, Texas or Mexico or something like that. But I've seen a lot of things from Buffalo that should be able to be seen, and I'm hoping that the eclipse is one of those. First week of April is not a great time, especially I think it's afternoon, isn't it? So I guess I'll make a decision shortly before. I love the experience of doing it and being there so much. I really didn't take very many pictures in this last one, and I'm so glad I set myself with a light agenda. If my pictures are missing or your pictures are missing, there'll only be 10,000 fabulous pictures to enjoy, and the experience is so it's just so overpowering. I should have done it earlier, but I never did, and I'll tell you the most dramatic moment of this eclipse for me was realizing that I was going to see it, because we had heavy cumulus clouds right before the eclipse, maybe 20% sky opening. But as the moon started to go in front of the sun and the weather changed, it opened up those clouds like somebody opening up a helium balloon. And they just went all over the place. And within 3 minutes, the sky was clear. It was just such an amazing turn of weather. And I just burst into tears as I realized that I was going to see this thing, because I was all set to think I'd traveled all this way and I was set to that I wasn't going to see it. And then it was fabulous, but it's an emotional thing, unlike, some great astronomical journeys are emotional for sure, but it's definitely one. If you haven't seen it, make sure you get a peek.
Excellent.
I would agree with that.
Another question from the room?
Yeah, I'm really intrigued by what looks like almost a three-dimensional view of some of the prominences or even some of the sunspots. Looking at, especially near the limb, it looks like there's a valley or or I mean, of course, there's things sticking up, and some of that is going to be just sort of artificial, your brain playing tricks on you. But I wonder if anybody has tried some way to do stereo imaging of these these three-dimensional structures. Do you know anything about that?
Well, I do see things like that being shared, especially into sunspots, trying to exaggerate the depth of sunspots to get a sense of them. But I believe that they do exist in dimension.
Yeah.
I don't think it's not an artificial illusion, and the filaments. We know what they look like because filaments are just prominences that are seen against the face of the sun. So when you see these filaments looking like giant white snakes, that is exactly what they are. They do launch themselves into space, kept aloft by the balance of gravity and the solar wind, until one of them wins, and they're either pulled back into the solar surface or blown off into space by the solar wind. So these things do have tremendous heights. So that's one of the reasons we put the Earth diameter out there, so we can appreciate these things that are, the length of some of those big prominences are to the Earth and the Moon and part way back. So the scale and dimension of them is real. And it's just a matter of, trying to express that, through visual tweaking of the image.
So it would be difficult to do a real stereo image with like the way we have two eyes on either side of, say, the Earth. Still might not get the separation of that. But it occurs to me that we could use the sun to create two separated images as the sun rotates. I don't know, we'd have to get the timing right, but you'd have two slightly different images and then put them in a stereograph and try to get that depth perception effect. So,
I used to know someone who was fascinated with that. I haven't heard from him in a long time. He had wanted to and had used some of my images to do that, but I wasn't quite sure of what techniques he was putting to it. I don't know. There's all kinds of, solar science too gets pretty complicated. I'm a hobbyist scientist and a professional artist, but I quickly get out of my league when I start dealing with solar science and even just the mathematics of astronomy. I always depend when I do a talk in public on having a 14-year-old kid to answer a lot of the questions that come up, because the ones that I've known I've forgotten, and the ones that I don't know I've never known. So,
well, I'm a scientist, and I think that you shouldn't discount your ability as an artist, because many of the artists I know have to develop great technical ability to work in their medium. I have a friend who's a sculptor in metal, and he knows all the ins and outs of welding.
uh-huh.
And he has to do his art, but he has to do more than just welding car parts together. So you've obviously put a lot of attention to detail in all this that some of the scientists have missed, and yet have a lot of familiarity with it as they do. So,
Well, thank you.
thank you.
Marvelous. Any other questions in the room? Oh, one more in the room. Oh, come up and get the mic. He's being attacked by microphones.
Feeling like Elvis now. When a solar flare, say, snaps off and it gets caught by the solar winds, does it just eventually burns itself out?
Well, the prominences are not solar flares. There are often physical components to solar flares, as in that one that we saw that was jutting out into space a long ways. But the prominences are are massive formations of hydrogen plasma that are being ejected from usually ejected from the chromosphere of the sun and pulled back down, usually around active regions, and usually with both polarity, negative and positive polarity. And at some point, they don't last forever. The really big ones can last and be fairly stable for days at a time. But something usually gives, either the magnetism and the gravity gives way to the solar wind, pushing it out, and it just goes off into space. I'm not quite sure what happens to it. Sometimes you can follow it for quite a ways visually. I love seeing detached prominences and trying to spot them getting further away from the surface of the sun. And when they go inside, you can watch them collapse over time back into the chromosphere. A lot of folks are using video techniques now to do really marvelous videos of the movement of these prominences. If you do a stop motion type of movie over a few hours and watch it, the material move along the prominence and go back down into the sun, almost like a waterfall. Those things are really just wonderful. I haven't done too much of that, but there's a lot of great stuff out there. The Facebook group Solar Activity is a lot of fun to follow. There are also some Instagram contributors who. There's a fellow named Simon who's in California who has a big following, who does mostly video, and watching the sun move in real time is, or sped up time, is really a great way to understand these features and how they have their lifespan, what happens to them along their lifespan.
Outstanding.
Thank you.
Other questions? Are we tapped out? Looks like we don't have any further questions. So, Ellen, I would like to thank you so much. It's been absolutely fascinating. Those are beautiful. I've met Randy Shivak and Pamela. I think they're in Florida now.
Yeah.
And big fan of Solar Activity. I have one photo on there that they almost threw me off the page for because it was taken here at New Paltz. And they thought it was the moon. It was taken through welding glass, and it's we had 20 minutes, I think, to view the transit of Venus here at the school, and I managed to snap that shot, and I just pushed the heck out of it with some really lousy software, not doing anything great. But with the clouds and all the craziness, they said, we almost tossed you off because we thought we gave you a picture of the moon. But
well, you got lots
marvelous.
of time to practice before the next one.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely. All right, well, thank you so much. It's been wonderful. Maybe we'll hear from you again soon. And with that,
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you very much, guys. Really a pleasure to talk to you.
all right, take care, and we'll
and see you at the
close the meeting
next
out
meeting.
now, and the rest of us who stick around are going to head for the pizza place. Good night, all. See you next month.